The parables of Jesus are quite fascinating, and today we're going to look at one that I've called the smart lawyer. The lawyer who came to Jesus and tried to trap him with a question. I want you to hear what the Lord is saying to you through this particular story. Sometimes when we read a New Testament story from the Gospel, it's very wise to read from more than one Gospel. You do know, don't you, that most of Matthew, Mark, and Luke are very similar. If you read Mark's Gospel, you cover 90% of Matthew and 75% of Luke in that reading. Now, I want to talk about the parable of the Good Samaritan, along with this smart lawyer who came to Jesus. And it may be helpful to you to read it both in Matthew and Luke. If you do have a Bible and want to compare the two, you'll find it in Matthew chapter 22 and Luke 10. You got that? Luke 10 and Matthew 22. And they do have a slight difference. Or you say, does that mean the Bible isn't true? No, I think it just gives you authenticity. After all, if you sit down and write a story, and I write it on the same subject, I'll guarantee that we say things that are different. Now, neither of us are wrong. We simply have a different perspective. And that's what I believe happened with the gospel writers. Every so often we do find differences. I think that's healthy, because putting it together, we get a much clearer picture. Now, let's go back and see what happened when this man came to Jesus. And you need to know, first of all, that various groups were coming to Jesus. And so in Matthew 22, we find that Jesus faced a loaded question. Let me read to you from verse 34. Hearing that Jesus had silenced the Sadducees and Pharisees, one of them, an expert in the law, tested him with this question. Teacher, which is the greatest commandment in the law? Can you picture it? Here's this man, a rather bright man. He knows the answers to the Jewish law, and so he decides to trap Jesus. There are one or two things that he didn't do, of course, and that's what happened when people face Jesus like this. First of all, he did not recognize that Jesus was the master. He was the master of every situation. He was the master of every question that anybody ever asked him. And therefore, when this man put a question to him, Jesus was perfectly ready to answer. Notice something else, will you? Jesus answers in two different ways when people questioned him. First of all, he often gives straight answers, just exactly what they asked. I found something very special in this. When I was in England and had a church there, I remember saying to one of my friends in the congregation, a very bright man, a professor from London University, I said, we have one person in the church who's always asking loaded questions. How should I deal with it? I felt his answer was a classic. He said, Richard, just answer it the way it's given. Never give the slightest suggestion that you think it's loaded. Just give the answer as you would to anybody else. And he was so right. Over the next 2 or 3 years, I found it worked beautifully. Whenever this man asked a question, and you could almost see the red flags flying, you simply answered it to the best of your ability, and then left it there. Now, Jesus did very much the same thing. The other thing that Jesus did on occasions, you'll find, he would answer a question with another question. And whenever he did that, his question penetrated to the very heart of the matter in a marvelous way. Now, in this case, he gave a straight answer. In fact, I would take it a step further and say that his reply was an absolute classic. I've thanked this lawyer many times for asking the question, because in asking the question he did, he opened Jesus up to give us a teaching that we should all know. Let me read it to you. It's Matthew 22 and 37. Jesus replied, have you got that? Matthew 22:37. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, and with all your soul, and with all your mind. This is the first and great commandment. And the second is like unto it. Love your neighbor as yourself. Now, if you analyze those two verses, you'll find what a magnificent reply Jesus gave this man. I don't think he gave it just for this man. I think he gave it for you and me this morning. Let's look more closely. First of all, Jesus said, God is always first. And God must always take that first place in your life and mine. The moment anyone or anything comes in that place that God should have, we've moved into idolatry. Notice also, Jesus said, we're to love God with our whole being. Love the Lord your God with all your heart and soul and mind. Every part of you loving the Lord. Now that's fascinating, isn't it? Just let your whole being, as it were, soar up to the Lord your God. Secondly, notice, we cannot love our neighbor unless we love God first. You see the order in which Jesus put it. He says, first of all, love God. Now, the second is like unto it. Love your neighbor as yourself. And we do find some Christians who try to put number 2 before number 1. Very often they're people who get into the social gospel. They do good in a way, but they haven't got the horse before the cart. Love God, then love your neighbor. And I think what Jesus is saying is this. If you truly love God, you're bound to love your neighbor. That love will simply continue to the others. The third thing is this. We must see the sort of love he's talking about. He's talking about agape love, or if you prefer it, agape love. It's the same thing. It's the love that we see coming to us from the cross of Jesus Christ. When you consider the cross and you see how Jesus died for you, realize how much he loves you. He loves you with a selfless love. He loves you with a love that never ends, a love that never stops giving. It is an incredible love. Just consider the cross of Jesus Christ. And that's the love that's coming to you right now. Now, says Jesus, it's with that love in your heart, love God and love your neighbor. Let me remind you of something which I know is obvious. You and I cannot love our neighbors unless we have that love within us. You try loving some of the people that you meet. Unless you have the love of Jesus Christ, you're in for an exercise in futility. It simply won't work out at all. Now, there's something else Jesus said. He commanded us to love. That bothered me. Lord, how can you command me to love? Love's an emotion. Well, no, it isn't. Love is an emotion, but not first of all. Love, first of all, is a decision of your will and mine. You decide who you'll love. You also decide who you will not love. Have you ever thought about that? Have you ever noticed that you actually make a decision not to like somebody? I think sometimes we do it subconsciously, but we do it just the same. You do and I do. We do not love except by our will. And Jesus commands us to love. He said, you've got to love the Lord your God. We had a classic story the other day in one of our Bible study groups. One of our men told us how 18 months ago he left his wife to live with another woman. After 12 months, God told him to go back. And he said that voice or that thought was so persistent that he simply could not resist it. And finally he went back to his wife, and he hated her. And then finally one day he said, by my will I will love her. Once he said that, the Lord began to give him the love, and he said, our marriage today is the best it's ever been. If as you listen to my voice, you're in a marriage where you don't love your partner, I have news for you. You can, if you want to. By my will, I will love her. And then let the Lord your God take over. There's something else here which is classic. Did you notice that in 2 quick sentences, Jesus summarized the 10 commandments? If you take these 2 commandments that Jesus gave and keep them, you cannot break any of the 10. And the neat thing is this. Once you do that, you find that keeping the law is based on love instead of on legalism. Love the Lord your God with all your heart and soul and mind. That deals with the opening commandments. Love your neighbor as yourself. That deals with the rest. You cannot break them if you truly love. You say, who is my neighbor? Well, of course, the poor lawyer said the same thing. In Luke chapter 10, verse 29, the Bible says, he being willing to justify himself said to Jesus, who is my neighbor? It's funny, isn't it? We often try to justify ourselves. We want to say something a bit more just to show that we're all right. This is what this man did. And he opened the way for Jesus to tell the parable of the Good Samaritan. I could read it to you, but I think you can probably read it for yourself. It's in Luke 10 and verse 30. And in that, you remember what happened. A Samaritan was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho. It's a tremendous road, just ideal for robbers and thieves. And both a priest and a Levite had come along, and they saw this man, and they left him by the side of the road, dying of his wounds. The Samaritan who came along saw him, knew he was a Jew, and remember that Samaritans hated the Jews, and he went over, and he did all he could for him. He bound up his wounds, he put in oil to make him feel better, put him on his own donkey, took him to the inn, and said to the man at the inn, now you look after him, here's some money. I'm coming back, and if I owe you any more, I'll pay it. Fantastic. Now, says Jesus to the lawyer, who was the neighbor to the man who fell among thieves? Well, that's a simple question. Obviously the man who looked after him. Jesus says, go and do likewise. You can almost see this fellow's jaw drop, can't you? What, me? Oh, yes. But you see, the other thing is, Jesus say the same thing to us. Well, you say, Richard, who's my neighbor? Do you really want to know? It's a terrible shock. It's everyone you meet today who has a need. Think about that. Everyone who comes across your path of life throughout today who's in need, they're your neighbor. And the Holy Spirit will show you how to help them, if you want to. Of course, we can be like the priest and Levite. We can go and look at the need and say, yeah, that's terrible, and go by on the other side. Or we can even stay on the other side of the road and say, Lord, someone else will have to do that. You know how busy I am. And it's obvious that we can't meet every need. And it's not right that we should. There are so many needs around us. But what we tend to do is say, Lord, there are so many, I can't help anybody. And that's not true either. The Lord our God places people before us who need our help. Who's my neighbor? The person I find who has a need. The person you find who has a need. And let's be sure that we meet that need with the love of Jesus throughout today.